The velvet box in his pocket had cost him 3 days of stalled negotiations and a cancelled flight he'd rebooked twice just to be home in time. Ha Dongchul heard the voices before he saw the room. His mother's voice, pitched low and cutting, the kind of tone she only used when she wanted something to sound like mercy instead of a threat. He stopped behind the wooden partition, one hand flat against the cold, lacquered wood, and listened. "Sign these papers and leave Korea tonight," Shim Yojin said, her silk hanbok rustling as she leaned across the table. "Or I will make sure the prosecutors, the press, and the entire underworld believe you sold my son's empire to his worst enemies." Alice Beacon didn't move. She sat in her navy silk dress with her hands folded in her lap, and something in her stillness made the room feel colder than the threat itself. She looked at the woman across from her, decades of authority carved into every line of her posture, 2 syndicate elders standing behind her like statues, and Alice felt something settle low in her chest. Not fear, something quieter, sadder. So this is what she's capable of when she thinks no one's watching. What Yojin didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the man they believed was still on a tarmac in Incheon, 3 days from home, was standing less than 6 feet away. And he had already heard enough. If you've ever watched someone you love get quietly destroyed by people who were supposed to protect her, if you've ever had to stand still and let the worst version of your family reveal itself before you could stop it, this story is going to sit with you. Stay until the end, because the way Dongchul answers this isn't the way you expect. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because the stories on this channel don't stay quiet for long. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this one travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. 3 days earlier, Ha Dongchul was supposed to be somewhere else entirely. A stalled port negotiation, a broken deal, a jet he wasn't meant to be on. Instead, he was walking down the private hallway of his own penthouse with a small velvet box in his coat pocket, thinking about the particular way Alice tilted her head when she was trying not to smile at something he'd said. He'd married her 2 years ago, in a quiet ceremony his mother had refused to attend, and he had spent every day since learning that the hardest part of loving her wasn't protecting her from his world. It was pretending, most nights, that his world wasn't as dangerous as it was. He hadn't told her he was coming home early. He liked the idea of surprising her. He liked, even more, the small, unguarded look she gave him in the seconds before she remembered to compose herself, the real one, before the version she showed everyone else. He never got the chance to see it that night. In Dongchul's mind, the silence of the room dissolved back into the cold iron of every warning his father had ever given him about trusting people fully. And for one long second, standing behind that door, he understood exactly why the old man had never let his guard down, not even at home. He heard his mother's voice first, then the second voice, Elder Shin, low and formal, the tone he used when he wanted his cruelty to sound like procedure. Dongchul stopped walking. He pressed himself against the wooden partition and did not breathe. What he saw next, through the narrow gap where the panel didn't quite meet the frame, was his mother standing over his wife with a folder of documents and a look on her face he hadn't seen since the year his father died. She had spent 30 years surviving purges that took her husband and both her brothers, and every instinct she'd built from that survival was now aimed directly at Alice. "Sign these papers," Yojin said, "and leave Korea tonight, or I will make sure the prosecutors, the press, and the entire underworld believe you sold my son's empire to his worst enemies." Alice sat perfectly still. She had spent her career standing across tables from men far more dangerous than the 2 elders flanking his mother, and she was not going to let this be the moment she flinched. She looked at Yojin, the immaculate posture, the silk, the absolute certainty of a woman who had never once been told no inside these walls, and she said, quietly, that Dongchul had already placed the family's primary real estate holdings under her sole legal guardianship. That the papers meant nothing without his signature, too. The room went very still. What she didn't know was that the partition wall was only 4 inches thick. Dongchul didn't move. Every instinct he'd built running a syndicate since he was 26 years old told him to walk into that room and end this in 30 seconds. But he had learned, the hard way, that a man who reacts to insults stays a soldier his whole life, and a man who reacts to evidence becomes something his enemies can't predict. He stayed behind the door. He listened as his mother pushed harder, as the elders added their own quiet threats, as Alice held her ground without raising her voice once. He didn't move an inch, because a soldier reacts to insults, but a boss reacts to evidence. If you think what Yojin did in that room crossed a line, hit that like button right now, because what happens next is going to make you furious in a completely different way. By the time Alice finally stood, gathered the folder they'd tried to force on her, and walked out of the room without a single word, Dong-chul had already made a decision. He was not going to burst through that door. He was not going to give his mother the satisfaction of a scene she could spin into a story about his instability, his temper, his unfitness to run what his father had built. He was going to do something far more dangerous. He was going to disappear into the walls of his own house and take it apart from the inside. He waited until the elders left. He waited until his mother's car pulled away from the private entrance below. Then he slipped out through the service hallway without a sound, called Min Seung-ho, and told him to meet him somewhere no one would think to look. The room fell into a silence so heavy you could hear the silk of her hanbok scrape the carpet. And neither Yojin nor Elder Shin had any idea they'd just been recorded by the one man they thought was across an ocean. They thought they were cutting off a branch. They had no idea the entire tree had been watching them the whole time. That night he went home to Alice, held her in the dark, and said nothing about what he'd heard. Not because he didn't trust her, because he needed his mother, Elder Shin, and everyone standing behind them to believe they had gotten away with it for exactly 7 more days. Before we move into what Dong-chul does next, I want to tell you about something special for anyone who's been loving these mafia romance stories. If tonight's story is your kind of story, the tension, the loyalty, the danger wrapped around a love that refuses to break, you need to check out The Mafia Boss Fell in Love with His Assassin. She was sent to kill him. He was never supposed to become her home. The mission was a lie. The love was real. It's got everything you're here for: the empire, the secrets, the slow-burn romance that turns into forever. Right now, the full-length novel and the complete audiobook are both available at a discounted price for a limited time. And if you grab it today, you'll also get free early access to every future release we upload. That means you're first in line for every new story before anyone else sees it. Link is below. Go get your copy while the discount's still up, and then come right back, because Dong-chul's next move is about to change everything. 7 days. That was the number that settled into Dong-chul's chest the moment he stepped back through the service hallway, and it did not leave him for the rest of the night. He didn't go straight to Alice. He couldn't, not yet, not with his mother's voice still ringing in his ears, not with his hands still steady in a way that frightened him more than shaking ever would. He took the back service elevator down 11 floors, past the kitchen staff clearing dinner trays, past the night doorman who nodded at him like nothing in the world was wrong, and he walked out into the wet Seoul night like a man who had never been home at all. Min Seung-ho was waiting for him at the warehouse office 20 minutes later, still in his shirt sleeves, a half-finished cup of coffee going cold on the desk. He'd been Dong-chul's chief of security for 9 years, long enough to know that when his boss called at 11 at night and said only the warehouse, now, something had cracked open that couldn't be closed again quietly. She had the elders with her, Dong-chul said before Seung-ho could ask anything. He didn't raise his voice. That was the part that unsettled Seung-ho most, the stillness of it, the way Dong-chul spoke like a man reading a weather report instead of describing his own mother threatening his wife. Director Bae, Elder Shin. She had papers drawn up, annulment, asset transfer. She told Alice to sign them and leave the country by morning. Seung-ho set the coffee down. Does she know you were there? No. Dong-chul's jaw tightened, just barely, just enough for a man who'd spent 9 years reading his boss's silences to catch it. And she's not going to. Not yet. Any other man in his position, any man who had built an empire out of fear and inherited a family that respected nothing but strength, would have gone back into that penthouse and ended it that night, would have thrown his mother's elders out into the street, stripped Elder Shin of his rank in front of witnesses, made an example loud enough that no one in the organization would ever whisper about touching his wife again. That was the version of himself his father had raised him to be. That was the version everyone in that room had been expecting. If they'd known, he was standing 4 inches away the whole time. But Dong Chul had learned something in 12 years of running this organization that his father never had time to learn. A man who reacts in anger only ever burns down what's closest to him. His mother wanted a reaction. She wanted him storming through that door so she could tell the elders, tell the board, tell anyone who'd listen, that her son had lost his composure over an outsider, that his judgment couldn't be trusted, that the family needed steadier hands at the helm. If he gave her that scene, he'd be handing her the exact argument she needed to finish what she'd started. So instead, he told Seung-ho what he needed: full financial audits on every account tied to his mother's personal secretary. Surveillance, quiet and total, on Elder Shin's movements for the next 7 days. And someone he trusted completely watching the Incheon shipping ledgers, because whatever this was, Dong Chul didn't believe for 1 second it started and ended with a signature on a piece of paper. 7 days, Dong Chul said again, mostly to himself. Give me 7 days before anyone in that house knows I've moved. Seung-ho studied him for a long moment. And what do we do about Alice? If she finds papers missing, if she notices anything? She won't hear it from me. Dong Chul's voice dropped lower, and something moved behind his eyes that Seung-ho had only seen once before, the year his father died. Not because I don't trust her, because the moment I tell her what I heard, she's going to want to fight this the way she fights everything, in the open, with lawyers, with the truth laid out on a table. And that's exactly how we lose. This has to happen where no one can see it coming. There was something else sitting underneath that decision, something Dong Chul didn't say out loud even to Seung-ho. A question that had followed him out of that penthouse and into the warehouse, and would follow him home again tonight. His mother had produced those annulment papers with a kind of practiced certainty, like she'd had them ready for longer than one bad evening could explain. Papers like that didn't get drafted in an afternoon. Someone had prepared them in advance, had them sitting somewhere, waiting for the right moment to place them on that table, which meant this hadn't started tonight. It hadn't even started this month. Dong Chul just didn't know yet how far back it went, or how many people inside his own house had known before he did. By the time he made it back to the penthouse, it was past 1 in the morning, and Alice was still awake, sitting on the edge of their bed in the dark with her arms wrapped around her knees, still wearing the navy dress from that afternoon like she hadn't had the strength to change out of it. She didn't tell him what happened. He didn't ask. He crossed the room, sat down beside her, and pulled her into him, and she let herself be held in a way she rarely allowed herself to be held, like something in her had finally stopped holding its own weight. He could feel her heart racing against his chest, quick and uneven, the way it hadn't raced since the early days of their marriage when she still didn't fully believe she was safe. He pressed his lips to the top of her head and said nothing about the partition wall, nothing about the papers, nothing about the 7 days he'd just set into motion to protect her. He let her believe, for one more night, that she had faced his mother alone. If I strike now, he thought, feeling her breathing slowly even out against him, they will just find another way to bleed us. He would not give his mother the satisfaction of a war she could win by making him look unstable. He would give her something far worse: silence, patience, and a reckoning she wouldn't see coming until it was already standing in the room with her. If you believe a woman like Alice deserves a husband who fights for her without needing to be asked, drop a comment right now and tell Yo in exactly what you think of what she tried to pull tonight. Let her know the whole world is watching. Outside, the city lights blinked against the rain-streaked windows, indifferent to the war quietly beginning inside that penthouse. Dong Chul held his wife until her breathing slowed into sleep, and only then did he allow himself to think the one thought he hadn't let surface all night, that somewhere in that house, someone he trusted completely had already chosen a side, and it wasn't his. The 7 days had barely begun, and already the numbers were starting to talk. Min Seung-ho hadn't slept. He was still at his desk in the unmarked warehouse office when the sun came up, 3 monitors glowing in front of him, a legal pad covered in his own handwriting that had gotten messier as the night wore on. He'd pulled the financial registers from the Incheon shipping terminals the way Dong-chul asked, expecting maybe some sloppy bookkeeping, a discrepancy here or there, the kind of thing that happens in an organization this size. What he found instead made him sit back in his chair and stare at the screen for a long moment before he picked up the phone. Millions of dollars, not stolen in one clean sweep, which would have been almost easier to understand. Redirected slowly, patiently, over what looked like 2 full years, funneled through a chain of shell companies that had been built to look like nothing at all, small logistics consultancies, a paper trading firm registered in Macau, a shipping insurance broker that, as far as Seung-ho could tell, had never actually insured a single shipment. Someone had taken their time with this. Someone had built it the way you build something meant to last, not something meant to be found. He called Dong-chul before 7 in the morning. "It's not a rival operation," Seung-ho said, the moment Dong-chul picked up. "I thought maybe Incheon cartel, maybe someone trying to make it look like Alice was involved with them. But the money's not going out to anyone else. It's being gathered, consolidated. Someone's been quietly building a private fortune out of your shipping lines for 2 years, and they've done it well enough that it would have taken a war to notice if we hadn't gone looking." Dong-chul stood at the window of his study, still in the shirt he'd slept in, watching the gray morning settle over the city, and felt something colder than anger move through him. It wasn't a rival taking from him. It was someone inside his own walls, patiently building a second empire in the shadow of the first, using his name, his trust, his absence as cover. The money hadn't disappeared into enemy hands. It had been gathered right under his own roof by someone who ate at his table. "Trace the signatures," Dong-chul said. "Every authorization, every wire release. I want to know whose hand actually moved this money." He didn't tell Seung-ho what he was thinking, because he didn't yet have proof, only instinct, and instinct told him that whoever built this had been close enough to know exactly where to hide it. Close enough that no one, not the board, not the accountants, not even Dong-chul himself, had thought to look. Across the city, in a glass office on the 9th floor of a law firm that stayed lit long after everyone else had gone home, Alice Beacon was looking at numbers of her own. She hadn't set out to find anything. She'd been reviewing land use filings for a case that had nothing to do with her husband's family, cross-referencing property records across the Incheon Port District for a client whose community had been quietly priced out of their own neighborhood by developers no one could quite identify. It was slow, careful work. The kind she'd built her whole career on, the kind where the truth usually hid in a footnote, not a headline. That was where she found it. A cross-guarantee buried 3 pages into a corporate filing, tying a shell logistics company to a trust she recognized instantly because her own name was listed on it as a beneficiary. The Ha family trust, her husband's family trust. She sat very still for a moment, the office quiet around her except for the hum of the air conditioning, and read the filing again to make sure she hadn't misread it. She hadn't. Someone had used the Ha family trust, the same trust that, on paper, protected her, as collateral for a company she had never heard of, in a transaction that had happened 18 months ago, long before her mother-in-law had ever stood in her living room with annulment papers in her hand. She didn't know it yet, but 3 miles away, in a warehouse office with the blinds drawn, her husband's chief of security was staring at that exact same filing on a different screen, tracing it from a different direction, neither of them aware that the other had already found the thread. It was somewhere in that quiet, unremarkable moment, a woman alone in a law office, a man alone in a warehouse, both of them pulling on the same rope from opposite ends without knowing it, that the real question took root, the one that would follow through everything that came after. If this scheme had been running for 2 years, quietly, carefully, long before Alice Beacon had become Yo-jin's excuse for a coup, then what exactly had Yo-jin needed her for? Was Alice the reason for the attack at all, or simply the most convenient shape for someone else's guilt to hide behind? By mid-afternoon, Seung-ho had traced the digital signatures far enough to stop reaching for his coffee altogether. Every authorization on the shell accounts led back to 2 points of origin. One was Elder Shin's private office terminal. The other, the one that made Seung-ho's stomach turn before he even picked up the phone to call Dong-chul, was the personal secretary who had worked for Shim Yojin for 11 years, a woman who brought her tea every morning and had access to every signature Yojin had ever put her name to. Every line of code Seung-ho unraveled peeled back another year of the betrayal, and by the time he laid the full timeline out for Dongchul that evening, it was clear this hadn't started with Alice at all. It had started long before she ever stepped foot in that family, which meant everything Yojin had said in that penthouse, every threat, every accusation, none of it had ever really been about protecting the family's honor. If this makes your blood boil the way it should, drop a comment right now and type justice, because a woman who builds her whole defense on a lie deserves to watch it collapse in front of everyone who ever believed her. Dongchul closed the file on his desk, and for the first time since he'd stood behind that partition wall, his hands were no longer steady. His hands hadn't stopped shaking by the time Seung-ho called him again, only this time it wasn't Dongchul's hands that were unsteady. It was his lieutenant's voice, tight and careful in a way Dongchul had heard only once before, the night Seung-ho's own father died. "Elder Shin wants to see me," Seung-ho said. "Tonight, a private room off Gangnam-dero, the kind of place he uses when he doesn't want cameras or witnesses. He was specific about that, boss. No witnesses." Dongchul sat very still, the office phone pressed to his ear, the financial files from the day before still spread across his desk like evidence at a trial only he was presiding over. "Did he say why?" "No, but I have a guess and I don't like it." Dongchul didn't like it either, not when Seung-ho walked into that room 3 hours later and found Elder Shin already seated, an old man's patients arranged around him like a second set of clothes, a folder resting on the low table between them that he didn't open right away. He let the silence stretch first. He always did. It was one of the things that had made him useful to Dongchul's father for 30 years and dangerous to everyone who came after. "Your brother," Shin said finally, sliding the folder across the table, "has expensive habits for a man who works in a warehouse." Seung-ho didn't open it. He didn't need to. He already knew what was inside, because he'd spent the last 8 months quietly covering for a brother who couldn't stop walking into rooms he had no business being in, rooms with card tables and men who smiled too easily and never forgot a debt. He'd told himself it was manageable. He'd told himself he had time to fix it before anyone who mattered found out. He was wrong about both of those things, and he understood that the moment Shin opened the folder himself and turned it around so Seung-ho could see the numbers, a debt large enough to ruin a family, owed to men who didn't extend grace, held now, apparently, by Elder Shin himself, who had bought it up quietly the way a man buys up a hand of cards he intends to use later. "I don't want your brother's money," Shin said. "I want something much smaller, access to Ha Dongchul's private office safe, 20 minutes unsupervised, that's all, and your brother walks away from this debt like it never existed." Seung-ho sat across from a man who had just handed him his brother's life in exchange for a betrayal, and he understood, with a clarity that made his stomach turn, exactly how far this had already gone. Shin hadn't come to him with a threat. He'd come with a transaction, calm and reasonable, the way a man asks for a favor between old friends. That was what made it so dangerous. Men who threatened you could be fought. Men who offered you a way out of a problem they'd created for you. Those men had already won half the battle before you knew you were in one. "I'll need a few days," Seung-ho said, keeping his voice level in a way that cost him more than anything he'd done in years. "The safe isn't something I can just walk him away from. I need the right moment." Shin smiled, the kind of smile that had nothing to do with warmth. "You have 3 days. After that, I stop being patient with your brother's creditors." Seung-ho left the room with his hands finally, visibly shaking, and he did not go home. He went straight to Dongchul, and when he laid out what had happened, the folder, the debt, the 3 days, the safe, Dongchul listened without a single flicker of surprise crossing his face, which frightened Seung-ho more than anger would have. "You should have told me about your brother months ago," Dongchul said, quiet, not cruel. "I know." Seung-ho's jaw was tight. "I thought I could handle it before it became a problem for you." "Everything eventually becomes a problem for me. That's what this family is." Dongchul stood and walked to the window, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, and Seung-ho stood there with his career, his loyalty, and possibly his brother's life balanced on whatever his boss said next. "Go back to him," Dong-chul said finally. "Tell him you're in. Tell him you need a week, not 3 days, because the safe has a secondary lock you need time to bypass, that's true, and it buys us room. And Seung-ho." He turned around, and his eyes were not the eyes of a man who felt betrayed. They were the eyes of a man who had already decided how this ended. "Feed him exactly what I give you, nothing more. Not one number, not one name beyond what I hand you myself." "They think they bought my right hand," Dong-chul said, almost to himself, something dark and steady moving behind the words. "Let them believe it." Seung-ho stared at him. "And my brother?" "Your brother's debt gets paid tomorrow, quietly, through channels Shin will never trace back to me. Not because I owe you that. Because a man who trusts me enough to hand me his family's ruin instead of hiding it from me is exactly the kind of man I need standing next to me for what's coming." Dong-chul's voice dropped lower. "But Shin doesn't get to know that. As far as he's concerned, your brother's debt is still a leash around your neck, and you're desperate enough to use it against me." It was in that moment, watching his boss build a trap with pieces that included his own brothers suffering as bait, that Seung-ho felt the new question take root, the one he didn't say out loud. If Dong-chul was willing to let Shin believe he still had leverage over his own lieutenant, purely to buy time and information, how far was he willing to let this go before he stepped in to actually stop it? How much would he let his mother and her allies believe they'd already won, before the cost of that patience became too high for anyone in that house to survive? Seung-ho held the phone with trembling fingers that night, dialing the number Shin had given him, feeding him the first piece of planted information exactly the way Dong-chul had instructed, word for word. And when the call ended, he sat alone in the dark of his apartment with the terrible knowledge that he had just become a double agent inside his own family, and there was no version of the next 7 days where every side walked away clean. The trap was set, but as Dong-chul stood at his window that night, watching the city lights blur against the glass, he understood something Elder Shin did not yet know, that a coup built on other people's desperation was only as strong as the last man willing to stay desperate, and Min Seung-ho had just stopped being that man the moment his boss chose to save his brother instead of using him. Neither side knew yet who would step into the trap first, but only one of them still believed he was the one holding the leash. The leash didn't stay in one hand for long. It changed grip that very night, in a part of the penthouse Dong-chul rarely thought about at all, the narrow service hallway behind the kitchen, where the household staff moved quietly through their duties, and where, for 11 years, Kwak Jin-soo had never once given Dong-chul a single reason to look twice at him. Jin-soo stood outside the door of the private vault a little after midnight, a duplicate key pressed into his palm hard enough to leave a mark, and his hands were shaking the way Seung-ho's had shaken in that tea room, except there was no folder on a table in front of him, no polite negotiation. There was only a photograph in his coat pocket of his daughter's face, and a voice on the phone 3 nights ago that had made it very clear what would happen to her scholarship, to her clean record, to the quiet life he'd spent 2 decades building for her, if he didn't do exactly what Elder Shin asked. He told himself, standing there, that he was only borrowing paper, deeds, documents, not money, not weapons, nothing that could get anyone killed. He told himself a lot of things in those 5 seconds it took to turn the key, and none of them made the guilt sit any easier in his chest. What Jin-soo didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that the moment his hand touched that lock, a small camera hidden in the crown molding above the vault door was already recording every second of it, feeding directly into a monitor in Dong-chul's private study 3 floors up. Dong-chul was awake when the alert came through. He'd barely slept since the night behind the partition wall, and when the small red light blinked on his screen, he set down the papers Seung-ho had given him and watched, in silence, as a man who had served his family since Dong-chul was 26 years old opened the vault door with a key that should not have existed anywhere outside Dong-chul's own possession. 11 years of loyal service vanished in the 5 seconds it took to turn that brass key, and Dong-chul felt something in his chest crack quietly, without sound, The way old wood splits from the inside long before anyone notices the beam is compromised. He didn't call security. He didn't move at all, not at first. He sat in the dark of his study and watched Jinsu's hands move through the vault with the careful precision of a man who had clearly been given instructions, not grabbing everything, not panicking, reaching specifically for the folder containing the original real estate deeds, the same holdings Alice had mentioned to his mother's face just days before. Someone had told Jinsu exactly what to take. Someone who knew precisely which documents mattered most. Dongchul's first instinct, the old instinct, the one his father would have followed without hesitation, was to have Jinsu pulled from that hallway before he made it 3 steps with those papers. But Dongchul had learned, over these last several days, that stopping a thief only told you that a theft had happened. Following him told you where the theft was going, and who was waiting on the other end to receive it. So he let it happen. He watched Jinsu slip the folder into his jacket, lock the vault back the way he'd found it, and disappear down the service hallway like a man who believed, for now, that no one had seen him at all, and Dongchul picked up his phone and quietly told Seungho to have someone follow the steward's movements for the rest of the night without ever making contact. Somewhere in the middle of all this, a smaller and stranger question had begun to nag at Dongchul, one he hadn't said aloud to anyone yet. If his mother's coup had been running for 2 years before Alice ever entered the family, and if the annulment papers she'd waived in that penthouse had clearly been drafted long before this most recent crisis, then who exactly had those documents originally been prepared for? Because a plan built that far in advance didn't sound like a mother improvising against a daughter-in-law she disliked. It sounded like something aimed at someone else entirely, long before Alice Beacon had ever been part of the picture. 2 floors below, in the home study she used for her late-night casework, Alice noticed something was wrong before she could name what it was. It wasn't the kind of disorder a burglar leaves behind, nothing thrown, nothing broken, no drawer left hanging open in a hurry. It was quieter than that. A folder she remembered leaving squared against the edge of her desk sat half an inch off-center. A drawer that always stuck when you closed it shut too easily now, like someone had oiled the track. Small things. The kind of things you'd only notice if you were a woman who had spent her whole career reading rooms for what didn't belong in them. She stood very still in the doorway of her own study, and she understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with proof and everything to do with instinct, that this hadn't been a search for jewelry or cash. Someone had come through this room looking for something specific, something that mattered legally, and they had been careful enough, patient enough, to almost get away with it clean. She didn't call Dongchul. She didn't call the police. She sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, and began quietly documenting every file that might be missing, every date, every possible motive. Because if someone inside this house was working against her, she intended to meet that betrayal with the one weapon she had always trusted more than fear. The truth, written down, time-stamped, and impossible to argue with. If you think Alice handled that disrespect like an absolute queen, refusing to panic, refusing to scream, simply gathering her evidence in silence, hit subscribe right now, because a woman like her deserves to be seen by everyone watching this story unfold. Upstairs, Dongchul watched the security monitor go dark as Jinsu disappeared from frame, and he felt the last piece of something inside him quietly finish breaking. Not rage, not yet, something closer to grief. The particular grief of realizing that the people closest to you had been carrying secrets you never once thought to ask about. He picked up the phone to call Seungho back, and just as it began to ring, a second alert lit up his screen, one he hadn't been expecting at all, a name, tagged from the vault's inventory log, belonging to a document that should never have been sitting in that vault in the first place. Before this story goes any further, I want to let you know something for the loyal fans of this channel who have been with us through every one of these stories. As a thank you, the Mafia Boss Fell in Love with His Assassin is currently available at a special discounted price, just for you, the full novel and the complete audiobook, ready for instant download. She was sent to kill him. He was never supposed to become her home. The mission was a lie, but the love was real, and if you've been loving Dongchul and Alice's story, this one is going to hit you just as hard. Grab it now while the discount is still active. The link is right below, and then come back, because what Dongchul just found in that vault is about to change everything. The name on the vault log was one Dongchul hadn't expected to see, and it stopped him mid-breath before he'd even finished dialing Seungho back. Because tucked among the deeds Jinsu had stolen was a document Dongchul himself had never filed there, never signed, and never once laid eyes on until that exact moment. He didn't have time to sit with the shock of it. Somewhere in the last 12 hours, while he'd been tracking a thief through hidden cameras and burying his own grief over broken loyalty, Elder Shin had moved faster than anyone anticipated. Word came in just before dawn, carried by Seungho in a voice tight with urgency. Shin's liaison, a soft-spoken fixer named Jin Woo, had already reached out to 3 of the organization's regional captains, requesting an emergency council session before noon. The pretext was simple, and on its surface, devastating, new evidence, Jin Woo claimed, tying Alice Beacon directly to financial ties with a rival Incheon operation. Evidence serious enough to justify an emergency vote on whether Dongchul's leadership could be trusted, while his personal life compromised the organization's security. Dongchul understood immediately what this was. Not a rumor. Not an accusation floated quietly through back channels. This was Elder Shin trying to convert whispers into an institutional weapon, using the machinery of the organization itself to legitimize what was, at its core, a lie built to destroy a marriage and seize control. He had hours, not days, to stop it. He didn't call an all-hands meeting. He didn't gather his own allies into a show of force, which was exactly what Shin would expect and exactly what would look, to any watching eye, like a man scrambling to defend himself. Instead, Dongchul did something quieter and far more surgical. He requested private, individual meetings with Captain Lee and Director Bae before the council session. The same Director Bae who had stood behind his mother in that penthouse days earlier, watching in silence while Yo-jin threatened Alice's life. Captain Lee arrived first, at a modest tea house Dongchul had chosen specifically because it belonged to no one's faction, old and quiet and unremarkable, the kind of place where conversations happened rather than performances. Dongchul didn't waste time on pleasantries. He set a folder on the table between them, the audited banking records Seungho had spent 2 sleepless nights compiling, showing in exhaustive, undeniable detail the 2 years of embezzlement running through Elder Shin's shell accounts. "You came here to vote on my marriage," Dongchul said, watching the captain's face carefully as he opened the folder. "You should be voting on your own survival, because every account Shin used to build this scheme touched contracts your division signed off on. If this comes out in an open council vote, it won't just be my name attached to it. It'll be yours." Captain Lee went very still, turning pages he clearly hadn't expected to see, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to fear as the scale of it settled in. He had believed, walking into that tea house, that he was being asked to weigh in on a domestic scandal. He was leaving having understood that he'd nearly been made complicit in a 2-year financial crime that could have ended his career, his freedom, possibly his life, and he hadn't even known it was happening. Director Bae was harder. He'd stood in that penthouse himself, after all, watched Yo-jin point her finger at Alice without objection, and Dongchul suspected, correctly, that some part of the older man had genuinely believed in his mother's cause, or at least believed it was safer to stand behind her than against her. But when Dongchul laid the same records in front of him an hour later, in a private office with the door closed, he watched something similar happen. Not loyalty breaking so much as fear recalibrating. A lifetime spent learning which way the wind actually blew now bending in a new direction. "Elder Shin told you this vote was about protecting the organization," Dongchul said quietly. "It was never about protecting anything. It was about making sure no one looked too closely at where 2 years of shipping revenue actually went. If you vote with him today, you're not defending tradition. You're covering for a thief." By the time the emergency council session convened that afternoon, in the same formal chamber where Elder Shin had planned to present his fabricated evidence and force a vote of no confidence, something had already shifted that neither Shin nor Jin Woo had accounted for. The elder thought he had 3 votes secured in his pocket, a clean majority waiting to be called. He had no idea the room had already been cleared of everyone he was counting on. Somewhere in the middle of that quiet reversal, the private meetings, the folders passed hand to hand, the captains recalculating their loyalties in real time, a question surfaced that Dongchul hadn't had time to answer yet, one that sat uneasily alongside everything else he'd uncovered that week. If Elder Shin had been careful enough to hide 2 years of theft from the entire organization, careful enough to manufacture a crisis this elaborate just to force one vote, then what was he truly protecting himself from? And who else, beyond Yojin, had known about this scheme from the very beginning? Elder Shin stood at the head of that chamber and began to speak, laying out his fabricated case against Alice with the same practiced confidence he'd used for 30 years to move rooms in his favor. And it took him nearly 2 full minutes to notice that Captain Lee wasn't nodding along the way he expected, that Director Bay's eyes had gone carefully, deliberately blank in a way that meant something had already been decided before he'd said a single word. Loyalty in their world had never come from love. It came from knowing who controlled the evidence, and by the time Elder Shin finally understood whose hand that had become, the vote he'd engineered to destroy Dongchul's marriage had already quietly turned into the beginning of his own undoing, and he was the only person in that chamber who didn't yet know it. If you've ever wanted to step out from behind a wall the moment you heard someone you love being threatened, drop a comment right now and tell me what country you're watching from. I want to see how many of us would have done exactly what Dongchul did, and how many of us would have waited for the perfect moment the way he did instead. Elder Shin never saw it coming, and neither, in a different way, had Dongchul, because while he'd spent the last several days quietly dismantling a coup built on stolen documents and manufactured accusations, his own wife had already started building a war chest of her own, 3 miles across the city, without waiting for anyone's permission to fight back. Alice sat in the glass-walled conference room of her law firm on a wet Tuesday afternoon, across the table from Grace Odom, the legal partner she trusted more than almost anyone outside her marriage, a woman who'd stood beside her through 3 different conflict zone postings before either of them had ever set foot in Seoul. Grace had known Alice long enough to recognize the particular stillness in her when something serious was happening, the same stillness Alice wore in courtrooms right before she delivered the argument that ended a case. "Walk me through it again," Grace said, sliding her glasses up into her hair, a legal pad covered in notes between them. Alice laid it out clean and precise, the way she'd been trained to lay out every argument that mattered. The land use anomalies across the Incheon port properties, the cross guarantees tying the Ha family trust to shell entities she'd never heard of, the missing files from her own home study, moved just enough to notice, not enough to prove who'd done it. She wasn't building a case to punish anyone yet. She was building a shield, a preemptive injunction that would freeze any further movement against the family trust, protecting the assets, and more importantly, protecting her own legal standing before anyone could manufacture a case against her. "If they try to force through anything using this trust," Alice said, "we file within the hour. I want this ready to go before they even think about moving again." Grace studied her for a long moment. "You know this isn't really about protecting real estate." "I know exactly what it's about," Alice said quietly. And she did. She had spent 6 years in conflict zones learning that violence didn't always look like violence. Sometimes it looked like a woman half her age being told to disappear quietly. Sometimes it looked like paperwork designed to erase someone's existence without ever raising a hand against them. She wasn't going to let that happen to her, and she wasn't going to wait for her husband to fight this battle for her, even if she loved him enough to understand exactly why he hadn't told her what he already knew. She didn't know, sitting in that conference room, that Dongchul was 3 floors down and half a block away, parked in the back seat of an unmarked car in the rain, watching the glass building through a window fogged at the edges. He'd come to observe Seung-ho's surveillance report on the building's security, a routine check given everything happening around them. He had not expected to sit there for 40 minutes, watching his wife through a wall of glass, animated and precise, gesturing at documents with the same focused intensity she'd probably brought to courtrooms in 3 different war-torn cities before she ever met him. He realized, watching her that he had built an entire strategy over the last week around a fundamental miscalculation. He had assumed, without ever saying it out loud, that his job was to protect Alice from a world she didn't understand. He had spent 7 days moving in silence specifically, so she wouldn't have to face any of this directly. And here she was, already 3 steps ahead of him, constructing her own defense with a precision that made his carefully built forensic case look almost clumsy by comparison. They thought they were dealing with a trophy wife. His own mother had looked at Alice in that penthouse and seen an outsider, a liability, a woman who needed to be managed and removed. She had no idea she'd been standing across the table from one of the sharpest legal minds in the district, a woman who had already begun dismantling the very foundation Yojin thought she controlled. Sitting there in the rain, watching his wife work, Dongchul felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with strategy or survival. He had spent years believing his role in this marriage was to be her protector, the wall between her and the violence of his world. Watching her now, he understood that he had never actually been protecting her from anything. He had simply been standing beside a woman who already knew how to fight, and had been fighting, in her own way, since long before he'd ever met her. It occurred to him, somewhere in that quiet realization, that he still didn't know something important. Why his wife, a woman capable of building an ironclad legal defense in a single afternoon, had chosen to sit in silence in that penthouse rather than immediately calling in every legal resource at her disposal the moment his mother threatened her. She had the tools. She'd clearly had them the whole time. So why had she waited? Later that evening, back at his own desk, Dongchul finished securing full digital backups of every offshore transaction tied to his mother's accounts. Copies stored in 3 separate locations no one else knew existed, evidence now essentially impossible to bury or destroy. Between his forensic case and Alice's legal shield, the walls closing in around Yojin and Elder Shin were nearly complete. But as he looked over everything they'd built, both of them working in parallel without ever discussing it, Dongchul understood something with total clarity. The real reckoning wasn't going to happen in a courtroom, and it wasn't going to happen through documents alone. Whatever came next would happen face to face, inside that penthouse, in front of everyone who'd ever doubted either of them. Alice handled this entire corporate attack like an absolute queen, sharp, composed, 3 steps ahead of people who underestimated her from the very beginning. Hit that like button right now to show respect for a woman who never once needed saving, only the space to fight her own way. And if this story has you hooked the way it's hooked thousands of others watching tonight, you're going to want to know about The Mafia Boss Fell in Love with His Assassin, a full-length novel and complete audiobook available for instant download, the story of a woman sent to destroy the very man she ends up loving with everything she has. The mission was a lie. The love was real. Grab your copy using the link below, because once you finish this story, you're going to want another one just like it waiting for you. But right now, 3 floors below where Dongchul sat reviewing his evidence, Alice was still in that conference room, staring at one final document Grace had just placed in front of her. A document with a signature on it that made her go completely still, because it belonged to someone who was supposed to have been on her side from the very beginning. The name on that signature belonged to Grace Odom's own paralegal, a young woman named Sujin who had helped file half of Alice's caseload over the past year, and Alice sat there staring at it, feeling the floor of her own trust shift beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with her husband's family at all. She didn't have time to sit with that discovery for long, because 3 floors above her, in the basement storage level of the penthouse building, Dongchul was standing in front of a different kind of betrayal, one that had been eating at him for 2 full days. He'd waited until nearly 11 at night, until the building had gone quiet, until Kwak Jinsu came down to the storage level the way he always did on Thursdays to check the household inventory logs, a routine so ordinary that Jinsu had no reason to expect anything different tonight. He didn't see Dongchul until the door closed behind him, and the older man turned and found his employer standing in the dim light between 2 rows of shelving, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Jinsu's face went the color of old paper. He knew immediately, without a single word spoken, exactly what this was. "Sir, Don't, Dongchul said, not unkindly, but with a finality that stopped the steward cold. Don't lie to me in this room. You've done enough of that already. Jinsu's hands began to shake, the same tremor Dongchul had watched on the security monitor 2 nights earlier, and for a moment neither man said anything at all. 11 years. Dongchul thought of every ordinary evening this man had quietly moved through their household, tea brought without being asked, a door held open in the rain, a birthday remembered when even Dongchul himself had forgotten. 11 years of a man who had never once given him reason to doubt him, undone by 5 seconds and a stolen key. I know what you took, Dongchul said, and I know you didn't take it for yourself. Jinsu's composure broke then, all at once, the way a dam breaks after holding far longer than anyone thought it could. He didn't argue. He didn't deny it. He sank down onto an overturned crate, an old man suddenly looking every one of his 61 years, and the words came out of him in a rush he seemed almost relieved to finally release. His daughter, Elder Shin, had found out about a debt she owed, a debt so old and so quietly humiliating that Jinsu had spent 3 years hiding it from everyone, including his own wife. Shin had threatened to release the records publicly, to destroy the girl's reputation and her future, unless Jinsu used his access to slip inside Dongchul's private vault and remove the original real estate deeds. That was all he'd asked for at first. A simple theft, no violence, nothing that would ever have to come to light. I am not going to kill you, Jinsu, Dongchul said quietly, watching the old man flinch as though he'd expected exactly that the moment he walked through that door. I am going to make you tell the truth. Jinsu looked up at him, disbelief and exhaustion fighting for space on his face. You should. After what I did, any other man in your position would have. I'm not any other man, Dongchul said, and something in his voice made Jinsu go very still. My father would have. He would have made an example of you in front of the entire staff, and everyone in this building would have learned exactly what fear was supposed to feel like. I watched him do it more than once when I was young. It never once made this family safer. It just made everyone around him too afraid to tell him the truth when he needed it most. He crouched down so he was level with the older man, and his voice dropped lower, steadier. Your daughter's debt, how much? Jinsu told him, and Dongchul didn't so much as blink. He made a single phone call right there in that basement. Quiet instructions to have the debt paid in full before morning, erased completely. No trace left for anyone to threaten Jinsu's family with ever again. Jinsu watched him do it with an expression that slowly transformed from terror into something closer to disbelief, and then, finally, into grief. The particular grief of a man who understood, too late, exactly what kind of loyalty he'd betrayed. Why, Jinsu asked, his voice breaking, would you do this for me after everything? Because you didn't do this out of greed, Dongchul said. You did it because someone threatened your child, and there isn't a father alive who wouldn't have made the same terrible choice in your position. That doesn't make what you did right, but it means you're not my enemy. You're just a man who got caught between 2 people who were willing to destroy anyone standing in their way. The tears came then, unguarded, the tears of a desperate father finally set down after carrying that weight alone for weeks, and Dongchul let him have that moment before he slid a single sheet of paper and a pen across the crate between them. I need you to write down everything, Dongchul said. Every instruction Elder Shin gave you, every conversation with my mother, names, dates, exact words if you remember them. Not because I want to punish you further, because I need the truth in your own handwriting, signed by your own hand, so that no one can ever claim this confession was forced. Jinsu wrote for nearly 20 minutes, his handwriting growing steadier as he went, as though the act of finally telling the truth was lifting something crushing off his chest one sentence at a time. When he finished, he signed his name at the bottom and slid it back across the crate, and Dongchul read it once, slowly, in silence. By midnight, every single string pulling the betrayal against his marriage had been tied to a single hand, and it wasn't Jinsu's. It was his mother's, and Elder Shin's, laid out now in black ink with a signature that would hold up in any room in the country. Dongchul folded the confession, slipped it into his jacket, and looked one last time at the old steward sitting broken and relieved on that overturned crate. There was only one piece left to secure before the trap could close completely, and as Dongchul climbed the stairs back toward the penthouse, his phone buzzed once in his pocket. A message from Alice, 4 words long, that stopped him cold on the landing. "We need to talk." Those 4 words waited for him the moment he walked through the door, and Alice was sitting in the study with the lights low, a folder of her own resting on her lap, when she finally told him what she'd found, that the paralegal who'd helped forge the discrepancy in her firm's filings had been quietly paid by Elder Shin's people for months, feeding information about her caseload back to the very family trying to destroy her. She hadn't known that until tonight. And when she looked at her husband's face, she understood immediately that he already knew something too, something he'd been carrying since he walked through that door. There was no more time left to protect each other from the truth. Dongchul sat down across from her and for the first time in 7 days told her everything. The partition wall, the eavesdropping, the confession folded in his jacket pocket, the 7 days of silence he'd asked his own household to believe was ignorance. Alice listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she didn't ask why he hadn't told her sooner. She already understood. She reached for his hand instead and said only 4 words back to him. "Let's finish this together." They didn't have to wait long. Word came just before 1 in the morning that Shim Yojin, Elder Shin, and 2 of his remaining loyalists were on their way up, unannounced, carrying what they believed was a final, unstoppable case against Alice. Documents Jin Woo had assembled from the stolen files, ready to force one last signing before dawn, certain that after tonight there would be no one left standing in their way. They had no idea the room had already been prepared for them. When the elevator doors opened onto the penthouse floor, Yo-jin stepped out first, her silk hanbok moving with the same imperious rustle it had carried the very first night this all began, Elder Shin a half-step behind her, flanked by 2 men who still believed they were walking into a victory. The door to the main room was already open. The lights were already on. And waiting inside, seated calmly across from where Alice sat with quiet, unshaken composure, was Dongchul, with Min Seung-ho standing at his shoulder, and behind them, arranged along the far wall in grim, deliberate silence, Captain Lee, Director Bae, and every regional captain Elder Shin had once believed belonged to him. Yo-jin stopped in the doorway. For the first time in longer than Dongchul could remember, he watched something flicker across his mother's face that looked almost like fear. The door opened, but the victory Yo-jin expected was waiting for her with something far heavier than a signature on the table. A stack of printed bank statements, 3 folders of forensic financial records, and a single handwritten confession bearing Quack Jin-soo's signature at the bottom. "Sit down," Dongchul said, and it wasn't a request. Elder Shin tried first, the way he always did, reaching for the same authority that had carried him through 30 years of quiet manipulation. "This is a private family matter, Dongchul. These men have no place." "These men have every place here," Dongchul cut in, his voice low and level in a way that silenced the room faster than shouting ever could. "Because for 2 years, you used their signatures, their divisions, their trust to hide money you were stealing from this family. Every captain in this room has already seen the proof." He slid the audited records across the table, unhurried, final. "You told them you were protecting tradition. You were protecting a fortune you built by robbing the very people you claim to be defending." Shin's composure cracked for the first time in the entire 7 days, a flicker of genuine panic breaking through decades of practiced calm. And it was in that unguarded second that the new question surfaced, the one nobody in that room had thought to ask yet. If Shin had been quietly emptying the shipping accounts for 2 full years without Yo-jin's knowledge, using her authority as cover the same way he'd used everyone else's, then how much of tonight's attack on Alice had actually been his idea from the very beginning, using an old woman's grief and fear as the perfect shield for his own theft. Yo-jin turned to look at Shin then, really look at him, and something passed across her face that had nothing to do with her son at all. Dongchul didn't give either of them time to recover. He placed Jin-soo's signed confession on the table next, laying out in plain, undeniable language exactly whose instructions had sent a loyal steward into that vault, exactly which conversations between Yo-jin and Shin had set every piece of this conspiracy into motion. "You told her she didn't belong in this family," Dong-chul said, his voice finally rising, echoing off the walls of the room where his wife had once sat perfectly still while his mother threatened to destroy her life. "Now you will leave it." Yo-jin's chin lifted, some final fragment of pride refusing to bend even now. "I did everything to protect this family from ruin." "You nearly caused it," Dong-chul said. "Elder Shin used your fear to build himself an empire inside mine, and you were so certain Alice was the threat that you never once looked at the man standing beside you the whole time." He turned to the captains along the wall. "Effective tonight, Elder Shin holds no rank, no authority, no voice in this organization. Anyone who continues to answer to him answers to no one after tonight." No one in that room moved to defend him. Not one voice rose in protest. In 30 minutes, 40 years of matriarchal power and 3 decades of Elder Shin's quiet influence dissolved into nothing more than a stack of printed bank statements and a single handwritten confession. And Shim Yo-jin stood in the doorway of the home she had once ruled without question, finally understanding that the war she'd started to save her family had been used, the entire time, to destroy it from the inside. That midnight confrontation was pure justice. And if it made you want to stand up and cheer the way it made me want to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now, because you do not want to miss what happens next, when Yo-jin realizes exactly how long she had actually been the one being played. Yo-jin didn't argue when Dong-chul told her what had to happen next. That was the part that surprised him most, not her silence in the penthouse hours before, but the silence now, standing in her doorway at dawn with her bags already packed by hands that weren't her own, as if some part of her had known for days that this reckoning was coming and had simply been waiting for the courage to stop fighting it. She didn't ask to stay. She didn't beg for the board's mercy or remind anyone of the 30 years she'd spent holding this family together through funerals and purges and every quiet war that never made the newspapers. She asked only one thing, standing in the hallway with her coat already on, her voice smaller than Dong-chul had ever heard it. "Did I lose everything because I was cruel?" she asked, "or because I was afraid?" Dong-chul didn't have an answer for her that morning. Maybe he never would. But he told her gently that the countryside estate was hers for as long as she needed it. Quiet, guarded, far from the syndicate's reach and far from Elder Shin's name, which would never again be spoken inside these walls without contempt. She nodded once, the way a woman nods when she has already grieved the life she's leaving before she's finished walking out of it. And then she was gone, her car pulling away from the private entrance the same way it had the night this all began. Except this time, no one watched from behind a partition wall. There was nothing left to hide from. Kwak Jin-soo left more quietly still. Dong-chul arranged his retirement himself, a modest home outside the city, a pension large enough that his daughter would never again owe a debt to anyone, and a single conversation in which Dong-chul told him, plainly, that a man who breaks under a threat to his child isn't a traitor. He's just a father who ran out of better options. Jin-soo wept again, the way he had in that basement, and this time Dong-chul let him leave with his dignity intact, because some kinds of loyalty deserve a gentler ending than others. By the time the last car had pulled away and the penthouse had settled into a silence Dong-chul hadn't felt in years, not the tense, listening silence of the past 7 days, but something closer to stillness. The sun was already climbing over the Han River, gold and unhurried, spilling across the balcony where Alice stood with 2 cups of tea she'd made herself, the way she always did on mornings that mattered. He sat beside her without a word. For a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, and there was something in that quiet that neither the threats nor the confessions nor the 2 years of buried theft had managed to touch. A peace that had been waiting patiently underneath all of it, for exactly this kind of morning. It was Alice who finally broke it. "There's still one thing I don't understand," she said, turning her cup slowly in her hands. "Your mother had those annulment papers ready before I ever gave her a reason to want them. Drafted, notarized, sitting somewhere waiting. If none of this started with me, if it was always about Shin's theft, then who were those papers originally written for?" Dong-chul didn't answer right away. He looked out at the skyline instead, the questions settling into him the way certain questions do, quietly, without urgency, the kind that don't need solving this morning to still matter. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I intend to find out." And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the not knowing didn't frighten him. It simply felt like the next thread in a life he no longer had to face alone. He reached into his coat then, and Alice went still beside him, recognizing the shape of the velvet box before he'd even opened his hand. The same box he'd carried home 3 days before all of this began. Through a hallway he'd walked expecting nothing more complicated than the quiet joy of surprising his wife. "I never got to give you this," he said. "I kept it in my coat through everything. I think some part of me needed to remember what I was protecting every single day this week." Alice opened it slowly. Inside sat a ring, simple and unshowy, nothing like the armor of diamonds his family usually wore into rooms to announce their power. It looked instead like something chosen by a man who had finally stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. "I don't want a marriage built on what I protect you from anymore," Dong-chul said, his voice low, steady, stripped of every performance the last 7 days had demanded of him. "I want one built on what we face together. No more silence to spare you. No more 7 days you don't know about. Just this. Just us in the daylight from now on." Alice slid the ring onto her finger, and below them the city rose into its ordinary morning noise. Car horns, distant construction, the whole indifferent rhythm of a life that had almost been taken from them and hadn't been. For the first time since the night behind that partition wall, Dong-chul didn't feel the old instinct to check the room, to listen for a second voice waiting in the shadows. He simply held his wife's hand in the open air and let the city be loud and let it be theirs. The empire would never look the same again, but for the two people standing on that balcony, it finally looked like home. If Dong-chul and Alice's story moved you, if you believe love like theirs is worth standing up for, drop your final thoughts in the comments and hit that subscribe button, because this channel isn't done telling stories like it. And if tonight left you wanting more, The Mafia Boss Fell in Love with His Assassin is waiting for you right now, the full novel and complete audiobook, available for instant download at a special price. She was sent to kill him. He was never supposed to become her home. Grab your copy today, and you'll get free early access to every story we release next, because a woman who's lived through everything Dong-chul and Alice survived deserves to be first in line for what's coming. Link is right below. We'll see you in the next one.